Welcome to another episode of Toplines and Tales, the nation's favourite livestock podcast. And as always, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Harbro, for their continued support. I have to say that I find this week's guest absolutely fascinating. I hope you enjoy this one. This week on Toplines and Tales, we go to somebody who I've recently met and enjoyed company with, but somebody who's also been on this podcast before, PJ Budler, talking to me, I think, from... Well, where are you talking to me from, PJ? Because you get around a fair bit.
I'm at home in Texas, so you're getting me well rested today.
And you've been on your travels. I know when I saw you the last time, I saw you in Texas, and you'd just been to Toronto, I think, judging. And you judge a lot of cattle shows around the world, as well as other businesses that you're involved in, PJ. You're a busy guy.
Yeah, so judging has just organically become a big part of what I do. It wasn't necessarily what I set out to do in the beginning, but it's been an amazing way to learn about all these different cattle industries, and definitely an incredible way to meet different role players in the industry.
Said you'd just been judging this week. I think you were, did you say you were down in South Africa? Is home to you, of course. So you were down there this week and various other places, I think.
Yeah, I was speaking at the annual Bonsmara meetings. Bonsmara is easily the biggest breed society in Africa. They register somewhere between 70 and 80,000 calves a year. And then before that was Houston Livestock, that's one of the biggest shows that I judge, and one in Florida and down in Mexico. So I've had wheels under me.
You get some air miles in, you certainly do. And what I'm going to talk to you, and among other things, you run, of course, the Champions of the World competition. So we'd better just have a quick chat about that. I know we chatted about it last time you were on this podcast, but that sort of has only just finished, really. That runs through the winter, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that all finishes up on the first of each year. And again, another really busy competition, and some great new contacts were made through that, and some really interesting cattle went through that competition again. So yeah, I think I've got a tiger by the tail there. I don't think I can let this one go.
And just explain to our listener, those that haven't seen it, of course, you take the champions from various countries, all countries, I think, from around the world that want to participate anyway, and they put forward their best animals, or what they consider their best animals of each breed, and then you appoint judges there to go forward and then judge those against each other in certain areas. Is that about sum it up, PJ?
Yeah, pretty much. What we did in the last few years is include the highest priced animals from each breed in each country as well. So that's just added another dimension to it, bringing in maybe a slightly different phenotype and genotype in each breed.
Okay. And finished up with a lot of champions and a lot of happy people, and probably a lot of unhappy people as well. But that's kind of judging, really, isn't it? And in this one, you not being the judge, I suppose, appointing the other judges probably gives you a little bit more of a backseat to have a look what's going on, rather than being the man in the centre.
Oh, the arrows still get pointed at me. So I'm very used to not being treated like an ice cream salesman. I can't make too many people happy.
You certainly, yeah. I don't know whether you've got a flak jacket that you wear to these occasions, but certainly the amount of judging that you do, and so many different breeds. And we mentioned this last time I spoke. I think that you told me how many breeds and how many countries, PJ. If you've got an update on that, because it's mind blowing how much you've done.
I think I'm up to 103 breeds of cattle now in 48 countries that I've judged. So yeah, it's definitely getting more and more diverse.
That's absolutely phenomenal. And for those people that don't believe that there are 103 breeds, I think the last time I spoke to you, you said, well, there's probably thousands of breeds that people haven't heard of, and because you're getting into far-flung places where some of these breeds are made to suit that environment, really, and that's what judging is about, isn't it?
Well, exactly. And I think hopefully we're learning as an industry that a lot of those maybe undeveloped breeds that are regionalized to specific climates and environments are probably as valuable as anything for those specific scenarios. So we're finding value in the breeds that are maybe outside of the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. And those breeds, as I said, a lot of them are more to suit the hot climate. And I know you do a lot now with the Brahmin and the relatives or spin-offs, that's the right word, from the Brahmin breed, of which there are dozens of those, and the Brahmin's been high on your schedule. And I think you sort of told me that a lot of these cattle most of the cattle in the world are within hot countries.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. 70% of the cattle in the world are in the tropics. So if you add the subtropics to that, you're going to push that up into the 80s. And what is interesting, Andy, is very little research and development has been done by the major North American, European, Australasian genetics companies on these tropically adapted cattle. Most of the work has been done on Angus and Holstein, and they really are specifically adapted to the temperate areas. So I think there's going to be a big opportunity in the future, in the near future, hopefully, for the big genetics companies to put some serious research and development into the cattle that are adapted into the regions of the world that actually have the cattle.
Yeah. Okay. And are these cattle being bred, the likes of Brafords and Brarolays and I'm paraphrasing, but these breeds there are being bred in North America for that market, I guess. But you're saying that we'll see more of that being bred maybe out with the area.
Yeah, I think. Look, there are a lot of good breeding programs working hard at this. It's just interesting that the more traditional genetics companies haven't really touched on it yet. So there's huge opportunity when they do.
And are they
dip their fingers into that?
Obviously, you're involved very much with the genetics company, with Transover Genetics, who are specialists in that. And I've met, I think, your boss, probably one of the most clued up people in genetics maybe in the world. And are there genetics is there a gene that they can put into, let's say we can take an Angus and just put a few genes in there that would help it stand the heat? Is it that simple?
Well, I mean, if only it was. There is work being done like that, some gene editing where they're inserting a slick gene, for example, into a temperate breed to make it more tropically adaptable. But it's a lot more complex than that. There are definitely at least 6 different traits that an animal needs to be tropically adapted. So I think it would be a lot easier and more sustainable to work within those cattle that already have those 6 traits and breed towards a goal, whether it's for beef production or dairy production, using them, because it becomes a little bit of a party trick if you can put a slick hide on a Holstein, but then she still doesn't have the other 5 genes or traits that it takes to be tropically adapted. So you do something fun, but I don't think you achieve your objective through gene editing.
Okay. Well, let's clear that one up from your opinion. Anyway, I'm sure that people might have different things to say on that. And obviously, a lot of my listeners are in the UK, in Europe, and North America as well, where it's not quite so hot. Is there similar things with animals that will stand the wet or stand the cold? Is there a similar, or have we got the ideal animal that already does that without any help?
Well, I think there's been so much traditional breeding over the centuries for creating temperate adapted animals in a very, very good way. Breeding cattle that fatten easily, that have a lot of hair, that have a thicker hide, that are built more like a temperate mammal, more like a polar bear than a gazelle, for example. I think we've done a really good job of all of that in the temperate areas, and the proof's in the pudding. You go into Scandinavia and Siberia and up into the highlands of Scotland, you see really well-adapted animals.
So with that evolution you think is happening, has happened rather, and now you're suggesting that what's going on is the same evolution now is moving into the tropics, where you said 80% of the cattle are.
Yeah, so 70% in the tropics, and if you include the subtropics, then you get into the 80s.
Okay. And we mentioned that you're judging. You've done a lot of judging. That you just mentioned that we know you have, and well respected throughout the world. And recently, something popped up in my Facebook feed, and we keep in touch with Facebook with yourself and our Toplines and Tales community. And I shared that with a few of our guys, where you had taken it upon yourself to pinpoint, I think, 10 or 15 separate points, of which I think you called something along the lines of tips for buying a bull, which sounds very, very generic term there. And you listed all those, and it made fascinating reading. So that was one of the things I wanted to chat to you really about now, to put you on the spot a little bit, if you could recall some of those to us. Yeah, I've got a list in front of me of where you started, and I think well, tell us a little bit of the reasoning why you did that and how it's worked for you before we go into them.
Well, usually it starts with about a 3 a.m. jet lag wake up, Andy, and then I get some idea in my head. And this hot tips for buying bulls, it was the start of the bull season in the northern hemisphere and the bull sale season. And you start getting the propaganda and you start getting all the marketing, and it certainly maybe leaves a little bit of confusion in the market as to what they need to be really looking for. And a small portion of that market is genuinely looking for assistance in that. And so I get calls, probably once every second day, needing help with purchasing bulls, or I get sent a bull sale catalog and they say, what do you think and which one should I look at? And I thought, well, hot tips for buying bulls. I mean, let's see where we can take this. And I didn't know what I'd do with it or how many chapters there'd be, but I think I ended up with 14, and there are about 16 anecdotes that I'm going to add to that, and 4 or 5 essays. And I don't know, Andy, maybe there's a book there.
I was just going to say there, if you need a ghostwriter, I've done my share of writing books, as you know. Maybe something we can work on together, because it did fascinate me on that. But that's for another day. We'll probably edit that bit out. Let's just talk a little bit through then some of those traits. I mean, the first one you came up there with dollars or indexes, I think, and that's it's about making profit, I suppose. Is that where you get the door you came into?
Yeah, well, that was probably the first thing that piqued my attention. Is it's become almost a single trait selling tool now, is getting a dollar index put together and then directing your clientele to that dollar index and having them select bulls, based on that index. And that's become quite global. Certainly all of Europe and North America have engaged in that to some degree. And then Southern Africa and Australia and New Zealand have definitely engaged in that. And I think the point I was trying to make is you just have to identify who gets that dollar, because a lot of those dollars in that dollar profit index don't go to the primary producer or to the cow-calf producer or the suckler herd owner. They go further down the value chain to whoever's feeding them or whoever's processing them, or maybe even to the retailer. So, and that does make a difference. Otherwise you start subsidizing chains further down the value chain, and that makes you a charity organization. And I think the last thing that cow-calf producers need to be is a charity organization. Now, there was significant pushback to that, and I think what we got there was a good indication of where the industry's at. One of the main pushback points was that every dollar that is spent by the consumer, who in inverted commas is always right, comes back into the industry. So we should celebrate that. But if you're a cow-calf guy and you're only getting 2 or 3 cents on the dollar that's coming back, I don't think that's something to celebrate. So that was the one point that I was trying to make on that. And the other one is pushing back against the idea that the customer's always right, because they're not always right. And there are some really good anecdotes and scenarios that I tried to bring up during the series of showing that the customer isn't always right.
And the customer, we're talking the consumer here, or we're talking the customer for the bull? Well,
in this scenario, it's either the customer who's buying your steers, or it's the customer who's processing, who's consuming the product.
Okay.
We can define who our actual customer is several different ways, but our ultimate customer being the consumer, you can argue that they're not necessarily right either. So there's I think there's a good anecdote that we can maybe delve into later when it comes to that, as to why I make that point. But if we just assume that the customer's right, then we create a very, very interesting chain of subsidy, which is very evident especially in the North American industry, where oil and gas subsidizes cow-calf subsidizes feedlots subsidize packers, and the packers take everything.
Yeah, that sounds a familiar story, and one that's probably been growing over the last decade or two. Let's move on a little bit too. I mean, you'll have listed yourself there, and let's just sort of move on through these bullet points. If it was, you've then gone into EPDs for weight, or certainly for yearling weight. Is that? That again is something that everybody chases. Certainly, the people that I know, they're always chasing. Is it the one with the bigger bucket, or are we getting a bit more technical than that now?
Well, I think on the On the EPDs, I was just trying to apply logic. And I remember speaking in Salt Lake City at the Angus Convention, it must be 3 years ago now, where the question I asked was, is the average Angus cow in the US big enough? And the consensus was yes, some people thought she was too big. So I said, well, logically then, the, being average for yearling weight EPD is enough, because you can't want more than average if you say the cows are big enough, because those two things correlate 100%. And that for me is very interesting. You know, on one side, we're trying to bring our mature cow size down, and on the other side, we're marketing maximums for our growth traits instead of finding what the optimum is. So that was just the point I was trying to make there.
Certainly very much a logical point. That is no point in necessarily trying to sell you animals that are going to grow bigger if we've got them big enough already. I agree with that. And you're talking with figures here with, I suppose we are on both sides all around the world now, that accurate figures for those as well. And are those weight, those EPDs for yearling weight, are they as accurate as they can be, do you think?
I think of all the numbers available to us, especially in the bigger breeds, I'd say yearling weight is probably as accurate as anything, maybe birth weight being as accurate as well. And there was a study done by Dr. Dorian Garrick. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's from New Zealand. But he did a study with American Angus in the, I don't know, let's say 2017, 2018. He completed his study. And basically what he proved was very interesting. It proved the accuracy of these numbers, that between 1980 and 2017, the average Angus steer in a feedlot was making $143 more per steer. And this was selection based on the dollar beef number, or for high growth and high carcass and high marbling. So that had actually proved itself out in real dollars, that the feedlots were making $143 more per calf. What the study also showed, though, was that during that time, the average Angus cow in America from 1980 to 2017 was costing $137 more per cow per year to run if you were a cow-calf guy. So if you in the cow-calf business and someone else is feeding off the steers, you lose $137 a year so that someone else can make $143. So yes, they're accurate. You've built a really good vehicle that's going 100 miles an hour in the wrong direction. You know, so it's, again, with this discussion, I think it's important to either grant that these things are accurate and then prove why maximizing traits can be dangerous instead of optimizing them, or you go down the more tedious, more difficult task of disproving how EPDs and EBVs are built, which, you know, give me some time and a comfortable seat, and I love that opportunity to work through that. But I think it's just a lot easier to grant that they are accurate and then encourage people who do use them to try and optimize instead of maximize.
Okay, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense, that does, and you're exactly right. What you say there, that there are the naysayers out there. There are people there that disbelieve these things, but the bottom line is we take them that they are there. But it doesn't necessarily have to be at either end of the spectrum. Middle of the road is the place to be. Yeah,
and I think that's what I'm trying to get to, especially with the people that I work with, the producers I work with, is that profitability comes about by optimizing. Maximizing, you might get a few headlines and a few papers, but in terms of long-term sustainable profit, that's not where that ingredient lies.
Okay. And you move on then to mention fertility, and that's something I think everybody listening to this will be nodding their head. Of course, animals have got to be fertile. If everyone that's not fertile, everyone that's not producing, then your profit goes out the window very quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, we mentioned this the first time we chatted, Andy, and we might have mentioned it since then. And there's big pushback and blowback from the industry, especially from academia and from the breeder societies. They still maintain that fertility is low heritability, and I think I've tried tediously to explain why that's impossible, being a survival trait. But then the second part of that is that there are significant PhDs in the genuine sense of people who've got doctorates. We work a lot with other PhDs, the poor, hungry, and desperate, that are also scientists in their own rights. They're proving and disproving things on their properties. But the genuine, doctoral PhDs are also starting to realize, Dr. Joe Pascal from Texas, for example, that if we measure fertility correctly, we realize that it is highly heritable. So with that, for me, it becomes a simple sum. You take the two ingredients for fertility, being hormonal balance and high inherent body condition, or easy fleshing feminine cows, are fertile. And again, that is, I'm not going to give you reams of data on that, but it's self-evident. It's very similar to my trip to Japan in 2023, where I came back with the realization that almost everyone in Japan has black hair. Now, I've got no data for that, but it's self-evident. Just go there and see. And I think that's where the whole concept of high inherent body condition and hormonal balance equaling fertility, it is just self-evident. And if you've run enough cows, your females that are easy fleshing, full-bodied, and very feminine are fertile. And it seems like this is a scenario where the PhDs, poor, hungry, and desperate PhDs might have got there first, and the doctoral PhDs are finally catching up.
So we're saying basically fertility is a hereditable trait, and is that something that's picked up in the EPDs as well? Where does that, or is that something that has to be just proven?
No, that's just self-evident. I hope the EPDs don't go there, because they'd make a meal of that. But also, you've been very involved in the sheep industry, and I know worldwide in the sheep industry, a lot of people select their rams or their tups based off of the dams having a high twinning rate, or they are sired by rams that come out of ewes that have a high twinning rate. So again, that's just again proving that fertility is heritable. Otherwise, or highly heritable, you wouldn't mess with that if that wasn't the case. And they can, some animal scientists can get into semantics with that, and they'll go, yes, well, it's repeatable, but it's not heritable. But that's one way of losing your entire audience when you get into semantics over stuff like that. I think that anyone who's paying attention to it is starting to realize that because it's a survival trait, it has to be highly heritable, and self-evidence shows that.
So this is tips for buying bulls. I didn't read that specific episode, if that's the right word, that you put out on that. So how can somebody buying a bull, can they check for that fertility? Is that something they need to speak to the breeder about, or is there evidence then that they can find?
Well, a bull that is masculine and has high inherent body condition, so he's got some softness and he's full-bodied, he's not just a frame, he is going to be fertile. I can't tell you how many hundreds of bulls we fertility tested for our bull cells over the years. The ones that failed their tests indefinitely, the ones that sometimes you have one that spikes a fever and fails, or is having off day, but the ones that aren't going to pass, they weren't going to be on your sale anyway, because they're already showing some feminine signs. Maybe their sexual organs or secondary sexual traits aren't evident. So with bulls, it's the same trait. It just expresses itself differently. So your masculine bulls with high inherent body condition are fertile, and they'll come out of feminine cows with high inherent body condition. Okay. So it's the same trait expressed two different ways in the different sexes.
Okay. Clears that one up. And moving on, you mentioned something called balance. I think as a sheep judge myself and a cattle judge as well, it's something we all look at. And balance, I assume we're talking here balanced front to back here, are we? Is it a balanced carcass, a balanced phenotype? Is that where we are?
Yeah, so balance, you hear that word all the time in livestock circles, and I thought it might be good to actually articulate what I mean by that, because I think the term I used in that article was that it's a word like equity or sustainability. It means whatever you want it to mean. And I agree with you. For me, balance is the physiological balance, where all the body parts fit together appropriately and in the right proportions. And then it's that balance of the endocrine system. So all the glands are functioning correctly, releasing hormones at the right levels. And then that expresses itself in the phenotype. And that's where you start getting a masculine look or a feminine look based on testosterone flow or estrogen flow. Then it's a balance between muscle, the product we produce, and fat, the energy it takes to produce that product. So in females, estrogen makes fat, so females need to be fat with some muscle. And in bulls, testosterone makes muscle, so bulls need to be muscular with some fat cover. And then the last part of that balance equation was hormonal balance. So bulls that are masculine with some, a little bit of coarseness perhaps, and some muscle shape and tone, a little more strength, and then females with some estrogen flow and that are a little more refined, more silky, and then that easy fleshing, full-bodied look without having too much muscle shape and tone to them. And that's a long-winded way of saying balance, I suppose.
We'll maybe go on to this in a little bit more in a minute, but I remember when last time that we sat down together, you'd just been judging, I think, in Toronto, and you showed me a picture of the Limousin bull that had won the particular section, and what did I think of him? And he was a good bull, and you said, I like him through the front. I like the way he comes through the front there. And is that because leaner, lighter in the shoulder? I noticed certainly when we were in Denver that they seem to be breeding the animals so light in the shoulder so they can get easier calving. Are they breeding too much of the shoulder out of these animals, getting this easy carving? Is there, again, goes back to the balance?
Well, I agree with you 100%. I think they've bred way too much shoulder and chest out of their males and too much crest out of their males. You know what's funny, Andy? Like when a calf is born, let's put this into rugby terms, because most of your audience understands rugby. And I made a brief comment about this in Houston. I made a football comment, and I said, football is very similar to rugby. Football is, of all the sports available, it's probably the best game played by boys. Rugby is just a sport played by men. So it's two different scenarios. But when it comes to rugby players, say John Olomu, for example, he wasn't like that when he was born. He was like me when he was born. We were both the same way. And it's only once the sex hormones and the growth hormones kick in that calf then eventually takes the shape of a masculine mature bull or a feminine female, cow. So I think what these guys have done is they've misunderstood sexual dimorphism and how the sex hormones play when it comes to hormonal balance, because a bull with some shoulder and some chest and some crest that's masculine and hormonally balanced is going to produce a female that is feminine and slim-necked and smooth-shouldered, especially if you're selecting for reproduction first. And this seems, and why I think this has gone off track is because they focus so much on the growth traits, on growth and muscle and weight and carcass. They've ignored the reproductive traits. They've cheated their way in by feeding more to get reproduction. That the bulls become slightly feminine and the females become a little masculine, and you get sexual monomorphism. And this is not a natural mammalian state. The natural mammalian state is the males and females look nothing alike. And if you look at any mammalian species that's been left alone through natural selection, the males and females don't look the same. A lot of them almost look like two different species. So I agree with you. I think like the bull I showed you in Toronto, I think I showed you the female directly afterwards, and they were completely different. The bull was stronger, more shape to him, a lot of shoulder, and when I say a lot of shoulder, a lot of muscle on the shoulder. Remember, the calf's not born with all that muscle on their shoulder. A lot of big crest, heavy chest on him. That comes later once the hormones start taking place. And the female was the opposite. She was deep and wide. She gradually became deeper and wider as she progressed from her heart girth back into her flank, hip, and hind quarter.
Okay, well, that's certainly, again, talking sense of that and exhausted that subject on balance not, because I think you could probably talk about that one all day, and rightly a lot of other people will do too. And you then go on to mention the eye of the stockman, and that's basically what it looks like. I mean, you call it phenotype, we call it, I don't know what we call it really. Phenotype is the right word, I suppose, but it's got to be pleasing to the eye, and you have to look at these animals every day as well, don't you? Maybe not in a feedlot, but certainly in a cow-calf operation, or certainly in a grass reared operation. You've got to go out and see these animals every day, and you want to look at animals that please the eye. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think as long as our eyes are tuned in to functional efficiency, because what I've found traveling around is, one man's treasure is definitely another man's trash. People experience beauty very subjectively. But I agree with you. I think you have to eye appeal or phenotype, balance, structure. Even in the feedlot, these things are vital. An animal that's straight in its angles or coarse jointed and will probably get lame and founder first, they're not going to feed very well in the feedlot. They're going to nibble and go lie down because of discomfort. They're going to be the first ones to get foot rot, etc. So at every stage of an animal's life, balance and structure, phenotype is essential. Eye appeal is really, really important. And if the pedigree is doing its job, if the EPDs or EBVs are doing their jobs, if the indexes are doing their jobs, if the raw data is doing its job, then it should produce a balanced, eye-appealing package. And it was Kelly Scharf who said this a few years ago, and he might not even remember saying this, but I thought it was genius. He said that we've spent so much time focusing on the tools that it takes to create a product. So, if you're making a table, we spend so much time on the chisel and the hammer and the saw, and a limited amount of time actually appreciating the product it produced. And really, if the product it produces isn't functioning the way a table should function, it's irrelevant what tools were used. And I think that for me was a really good way of articulating what you're saying, and what I'm trying to say too, is just focusing on the animal that's in front of you and making sure that it has that balanced eye appeal and phenotype that's desirable.
Sure, I get that. And as a judge, of course, that's one of the few things, or one of the tools that you have is your eye to look at these animals. I know in certain situations you'll be given the data sheets to go with that, and in certain situations you'll be judging with two or three other guys with different opinions. But at the end of the day, as a judge, that is the one thing that you have is to see that animal, but you also have to understand what that animal needs to look like, and understand what that animal needs to look like. Again, I suppose we're going back to in various different situations where they are suited to the environment.
Yeah, for sure. And form does follow function, so understanding what the function of an animal is and then demanding that form represents that.
Okay. And you move on and talk about heifers, bulls, and I wasn't quite sure where you were going with this one, so I'll let you elaborate that in your own words.
Yeah, I think maybe what I did is use an American-centric term. So a lot of what they mean by heifer bull is basically a bull that's been used been sold to use specifically on heifers.
Okay, got you.
And that has caused a lot of problems, because naturally these are the more refined bulls that are maybe weaker. They are low birth weight, which would make them easier calving. But the offspring from these bulls naturally have a smaller pelvic area, just don't have that strength, that a lot of times the rumen function, the dimension it takes to be a good mother cow. And my argument was that we don't. It's a construct that's evolved in our industry that has become quite harmful, because it's created a subpopulation of animals that have been bred out of these heifer bulls or heifer specialist bulls, that don't really fit in with the rest of the population. And then eventually you get to a point where you can't really breed them to your bull that you'd be using on your cows, because they just don't have the pelvic dimension or the strength to be good cows. And I guess what happened there is I ran into a situation. I used wildlife as an analogy, and it seems that triggers a lot of people. But that in wildlife, there is no differentiation. When the males get together, they don't say, okay, you little guys, you take care of the virgins, we'll take care of the mature females, just so you go easy on the virgins type scenario. And the reason why wildlife populations are so uniform and so functional is because the same male gets to breed all the females. There isn't a separation of what males go to what females in a maternal scenario. And that seemed to have ruffled a few feathers. But it does make better cow herds because you're forced to use a bull that is not too extreme for the heifers, but still strong enough for the cows. So you end up, again, in the middle of the road with a balanced animal.
Size fits all, yeah, I get that. And I mean, I know going back the way when Charolais were in originally and various things, and they would use an Angus bull, going back into the 80s, I suppose, an Angus bull for their heifers to start with because they were easier calving, and then they would move on to using a Charolais bull on the later ones. But you're talking here from a pedigree outfit where if you're using an easier calved bull on your heifers, then you shouldn't be keeping the females off of that to go back into the herd. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're going to ideally, in the ideal world, which doesn't exist, I mean, I'm really being quite ideological now, you wouldn't ever have needed that terminal option because you'd have a very consistent animal that could do a lot of that. But in that scenario, yes, you wouldn't want to keep those females back into the herd. But a more perfect scenario would be that the type of Charolais being used would be one that is functional enough to calve to a normal bull, and you wouldn't be using extreme bulls on them to begin with. But in this, let's say a more real world example is yes. So you use a Wagyu or Angus or whatever you do to open them up, but then that becomes a terminal product. You then terminate those heifers with the steer calves.
Yeah, which takes away from your profitability if you're trying to run that as a pedigree herd. Okay, I get that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're taking away your cutting edge generation of new genetics potentially by just terminating them.
Yeah, I get that. That totally clarified to me anyway. You're going to start moving on to some of the finer points there, and something you mentioned was skull shape, and I suppose again that depends on which animal you're after. But my grandfather always said if they've got a wide mouth, they'd eat more grass with one bite, and there must be some some substance in that somewhere going back the way. But skull shape, just explain what sort of skull shape we're looking for.
Well, I think it depends what your objectives are, but whatever they are, the shape of the skull, the shape of the head it's the forthcoming attraction. That shows you what's going to happen in the rest of the body. So, like you said, if you've got a wide muzzle and a strong jaw, the width of the muzzle is exactly the same as the width between the pin bones. So you're going to have skeletal width throughout. If you've got a strong jaw, you're going to have skeletal strength throughout. And then obviously it supports foraging. With grazing animals, it's going to support foraging. Length of skull will determine maturity pattern and mature size. So a shorter skull is going to give you a more early maturing package, a longer skull, a more later maturing package. Width between the eyes is going to give you an indication of skeletal width and strength again. A shorter head with a bit more width is going to determine several things like tenderness of carcass, good temperament. If you look at sheep or cattle or even horses, a small eye that's high up in the skull is bound to give you uneven temperament. Again, this is self-evident. If you're sorting cattle all day and one comes in with a very small high eye, you creep a little closer to the gate or to the fence because experience, the data inside your brain has told you through experience that this one's got a good chance of coming for you. And then when it comes to traits like marbling, a more refined pole or the ridge of a horned animal's skull is going to indicate more marbling and more silky haircut over that skull. And there's several different features with the hair whorls, where the whorl is situated on the head, further up or down, again, is going to determine tenderness, fertility, and temperament, which all go together. This is a Washington State University study that showed that temperament and fertility are highly correlated. So that shape of the skull is going to assist with that as well. Now, if you want a really late maturing animal that's lean because you're going to feed it a lot of grain, then you're going to want a longer skull. And if you want a early maturing cow that you can finish steers of grass, you're going to want a slightly shorter skull. So I think what I was trying to say is there is no such thing as a good bull with a bad head. a bad-headed bull is not a good bull because that correlates. It's a forthcoming attraction, and the same with females.
I just find that absolutely fascinating there, PJ, and I've never heard it explained to me like that. I know I have looked a little bit at the Bosmara where they say about the swirls and the hair and various things that do indicate traits that maybe we weren't aware of, but and I certainly know that we all look for a good head in an animal. Most of us that breed anyway, we look for a good head in an animal because that's the appeal, that's the bit that you see when you look over the gate and look at them, and that's the bit that comes toward you, but actually explained in that scientific detail to me is fascinating, and I assume the science is there to back this up.
Well, the science is that for generations, the data inside you, as a scientist, using your farm as a laboratory, generations of data has shown that a certain head works on your property, whether it's a Suffolk ram or Angus bull or whether it's a Shire stallion. That is true data. I mean, and it's repetition because it's happened generation after generation, year after year. And again, it's the PhD scientists, the poor, hungry, desperate scientists that have proven this. Yeah, so there's incredible data. It's just inside us. More people just need to put it on paper.
Okay. Well, there we go. I've learned something on that one, certainly from a few of those points that you raised there, and I'm sure other people will do too.
Well, Andy, one more thing on the skull shape, and this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but not really. If you go to the pub, who's the happiest guy in the pub? Not the narrow-skulled guy with the eyes that are close together and he's got the glasses on the end of his nose, be just getting home from his chartered accountant job. It's the guy with the wide eyes and the wider head and the big, that big generous mouth. He's the one you want to sit with at the pub. Just saying. We also mammals, and it seems to carry through in our species as well.
You're making me feel desperately inferior now by giving that one out, but yeah, it's a great analogy. I love that. And moving on from that highly interesting and slightly hilarious subject there, let's talk. You talked about pigment, and I read your piece on the pigment, and that fascinated me because that's something really that I've never had much involvement with, and maybe something a little bit more applicable to the warmer countries.
Yeah, so I think of all the places in the world, the British Isles, a lot of Scandinavia, it wouldn't really be as inapplicable because of the heavy snowfalls in most Scandinavian countries. Denmark would be a bit more like the British Isles. So for most of the world, white on an animal is a hazard. And the main reason because of that is you get poor pigmentation on the extremities. So whether it's the testicles, eyes, udder, nose, etc. And whether it's infrared or ultraviolet, these light rays can be really harsh, and if there isn't pigmentation, it's like wearing sunglasses when you're skiing. That's a great analogy. If you go down the Alps without sunglasses on for a couple of days, it eventually becomes uncomfortable enough that you don't want to do it. So now imagine being a white-eyed cow with no pigmentation in the Rockies, and that ultraviolet hits you day after day after day, and outside of that trait, you've got longevity to raise calves for 12, 13 years, that extra pressure can really compromise longevity on an animal, and then sore eyes and weeping eyes. And I've seen a lot of this in dairies too, and a lot of it too. I was in Iran actually a couple of years ago, and on a big dairy, and their chief scientist, I said to him, "Are you guys selecting for pigment?" And he goes, "No, I mean, that's never been mentioned before." And I said, "Well, it would help your cows if they had black pigment around the eyes because of your harsh environment." And he said, "Well, again, is there data for that?" I said, "Well, let's go create some data. Let's walk through them." And I showed him all the cows that were weeping had white eyes. They were weeping down the one side of their eye. The other eye would be black, and their pink eye would be weeping. So, and then it gets worse because the tears form like a magnifying glass, and then that infrared or ultraviolet hits the tear, and then it can really create like extreme pain on those poorly pigmented areas. When it comes to poisonous plants, it becomes even more serious. So in a lot of parts of the world, especially as you get tropical and subtropical, and you guys have poisonous plants in the UK as well that animals can consume. with photosensitivity, if an animal isn't well pigmented and you can't get it into shade quick enough once it's consumed that poisonous plant, then that distress can lead to death quite quickly. Where the animals that have got good pigment don't suffer from that photosensitivity as bad as that. So yeah, it's not a cosmetic trait. It's actually it's a economic trait.
Okay. Something I'd never considered. I know there were a lot of comments on there regarding that. Certainly, I think from Hereford cattle breeders saying, saying about that. But you're absolutely right that certainly in the warmer countries, that's a sunglass effect, I suppose. And talking of the warmer countries, you mentioned adaptability, and it's something we talked about earlier on, I think, before we sort of got into this list, and adaptability being animals that suit the environment that they're going into, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the whole concept there, Andy, is that it's a lot cheaper to change your animal to suit the environment rather than changing the environment to suit the animal, which a lot of dairies and even beef programs around the world have done, is they build ponds and shelters and air conditioning and fans to try and make their cattle comfortable, where it's a lot easier to do it by just using an adapted genotype. With tropically adapted animals, the shape and size of the mammals in the tropics don't look like the functioning mammals are up in the temperate areas. That's just, take the bear and the polar bear and the gazelle analogy. Then having extra hide, so more skin. So you'll see with the Bos Indicus cattle, they've got a lot more dewlap, a lot more throat latch, more brisket skin. And that's the radiator. So more skin on an animal means more sweat glands. And the more an animal sweats, the more it dissipates heat. And Bos Indicus cattle also have more sweat glands per square inch compared to Bos Taurus cattle. The next thing is hide color. So similar to the pigment, black absorbs light, lighter colors reflect light. So low-lying areas, so if it's savanna or the prairies, the pampas, depending on where you are, what you call it, avoiding black in low-lying areas is important as you get into the subtropics and hotter areas. But high-altitude black or temperate areas, black can be very beneficial because it absorbs the light that's available, and it can absorb that ultraviolet and actually make good energy use of it. Then slickness of coat. So slicker hided animals reflect light better, and also it's more difficult for an external parasite to attach itself on that slicker hided coat. The Bos Indicus cattle have a subcutaneous muscle that can shake off an animal anywhere on their body. So if that animal lands, on the skin over their rib cage, it can shake just around where that insect is and shake it off, where Bos Taurus cattle have to use their tongues or tails to do that. So that's a big advantage of energy conservation. And then excretion of sebum. So the glands of cattle secrete sebum at different levels. It's almost negligible in the Bos Taurus cattle. The Bos Indicus cattle, you can smell it if you've been working with them. And that sebum creates like a sunscreen, but also an insect repellent. So all those different things make a huge difference to whether an animal's tropically adapted or not. And that's why the whole idea of gene editing one or two genes into a Holstein or an Angus, that's not going to make them tropically adapted. You need to hit all those traits in order for it to work.
Brilliant. A great assessment of that one. That's opening up even more. I mean, I think adaptability speaks for itself, but you've certainly explained that in a very much more detailed fashion. And you go on and then talk about muscle. And muscle, as you rightly said earlier on, is what the animal, a beef animal, is producing that we eat. We eat muscle, so we can't avoid it, can we?
No, exactly. That's the product that we produce. And I think it's just important that we balance it with the energy it takes to produce that muscle. And again, optimizing it instead of maximizing it. Finding that balance where there's enough muscle for us to have a product, but that there's enough fat for us to keep producing that product.
Okay. and extreme muscles. You'll have seen some extreme muscle examples that we have had in the UK and certainly in Europe, where things like the Belgian blue, the British blue, maybe not so much, and some of these other animals there that are producing extreme muscle because they say they're producing more meat, but that's not necessarily the case if that's detriment to profitability, maybe.
Yeah, well, that's the trick, again, it's understanding testosterone as a hormone, and especially now with some of the myostatin genes that have been identified in the last few decades. And I think one thing that especially cow-calf producers need to be careful of, any gene that takes fat away from a female is going to be detrimental to your bottom line, because profitability is the number one trait, for long-term sustainability in a cattle operation. And as we know, that's half the equation of fertility is fat. So if you've got a gene that's going to remove fat, you are hurting your bottom line in a big way from the fertility standpoint. And I think, that, like you said, a lot of the breeds you've just mentioned would have several copies of myostatin in them. So they're examples of breeds and cattle in all population groups that have got, the bulls are well muscled and the steers are well muscled, but the females are full-bodied. So they don't have that hard muscle shape and tone to them. And when you can get to that, you're on a really good wicket, because you've got your male offspring that can produce a desired carcass, and then you've got your female offspring that have got enough energy in them to keep reproducing it.
That makes sense. And then the one that I really did enjoy when you started talking about skeletal structure, and a lovely saying that you said, a bull must be able to lift his head to see into the next county, and that's something that not all of us have seen in every breed, but what a great expression, and absolutely paramount.
Well, I learned that expression in the UK the year I spent over there, and I think a lot of it, the benefit I had growing up, I think, was my mom bred horses. And shoulder angle in a horse is everything. That's the ability for that horse to lift its head, and it's the ability for that horse's shoulder to move and to have flexibility and athleticism. But there are more issues than just an animal being able to lift its head that comes with good angle. Calving ease, for example, angle is essential for calving ease, because if you think of how a calf presents itself when it's coming out through the birth canal, those legs are far forward, and it needs that angle from the shoulder to get that maximum flexibility as it comes out. So a straight-shouldered animal with the inability to have that, well, that's inflexible, you've got a calving ease issue coming up there too. The other thing is foot structure and foot quality. Andy, calves are born with good feet. We've all seen a lot of calves born. They're not long-toed and curly-toed when they're born. They're all born with pretty much similar feet. So logically, that tells me that the issues are coming from the upper skeleton. So if you've got a very straight shoulder and a forward knee and lack of flexibility in the joints, it's going to put too much pressure on that foot, and it's either going to grow flat and out, or it's going to curl. And the same with the hind leg. If you flatten that rump too much from hip to pin, immediately that's going to compromise your hock joint. You're going to have too much pressure on the hock joint, and that's going to compromise foot shape and foot size. So that's where structure is essential. But besides the obvious things, such as animals needing to be able to move and be athletic, graze for long periods of time every day for a long life, to be able to move across large pastures or paddocks in the more extensive areas. Yeah, that's all 100% essential. But it also affects foot quality, and then even in feedlot cattle that are badly structured founder quickly. So structure is important in terminal and in maternal cattle. And I think we might have neglected that by maximizing growth and size, because the bigger, more growthy animals that are extremely sized tend to be straighter shouldered and straighter on their hind legs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And certainly that's something that we all look at as judges. You look for structure, we look for walking, the things that we can see sideways on. I'm just going to go a little bit at controversial, if you like, there. What about the top line? Something I've always looked for in an animal. We've been told that you need a top line from tail to the back of the shoulder, and the same as you need a level line underneath. And that's something I certainly see in the US that I've been a couple of times recently, that the top line, they're exaggerating the dip in the top line. And is that something that the dip in the top line is making the animals better to in reproduction in a profitable way?
Again, it comes down to balance. The most important thing is having a relaxed spine. So for an animal to be able to move and function for a long time, a tight spine where it tends to roach up a little bit is probably the least. That would be of all the different types of spines, that would be the least desirable, because that's going to affect mobility and it's going to affect comfort in the skeleton. So ideally, what you want is, when they stand, is to have a strong spine, that where the spine holds up. But when they move, that it doesn't roach. So it stays relaxed on the move. Now, that's been over-exaggerated, I would say, in North America. And part of that has been trying to get a levelness from hooks, from hips, or what they call here hooks to pins, which also, there's absolutely no reason for that other than aesthetic appeal if you train that way. So the balance is going to be in the middle, where you've got a good level, strong spine, but that is relaxed on the move, instead of one that roaches up. But you also don't want a soft sway back, because then you don't have strength of spine. And strength of spine is required for two things. For one is packing muscle on top there. And the second thing is for rumen function, for spring of rib. If you want a big barrel of a rib cage, you need a strong spine to hold that up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as you said, like, if the animals are being judged on the move, then I can understand they look leveler if they do have that sway back. But they tend to be more judged standing still, I would say. And some of that does look as though it's been exaggerated a bit too much, and the cattle dressing boys making it even more so to see that. But maybe that's just a fashion that we're seeing in the US just now that maybe just doesn't quite compute with me.
Yeah, no, it doesn't compute with me either. I'm on the same page with you there. For longevity purposes and just for functionality, a strong spine in any mammal is essential.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I wouldn't say we've exhausted your entire list. I know there are other things in there. I seem to remember that number 14. I think it was 14. We'd got to. You said eat, walk, reproduce, and basically those are the three main traits that we're looking for in an animal. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
I think we've covered that. In the bulls, what we could add there is just good testicle size, shape, and suspension. Good testicle size at a young age determines fertility in the bull and in his female offspring. And then a clean, tidy enough sheath, as long as that bull's got good control over his sheath. And then in his dam, you really want a good udder. You want a good level udder floor and tightly suspended udder with small pliable teats that are evenly spaced and a good fore-udder attachment. We might be guilty in the beef industry worldwide of not having paid enough attention to udders. And what I found with the unimproved breeds around the world is they all have good udders. So this is something we've done to them. Cattle inherently have good udders. The ones with bad udders, we've messed up by propagating growth hormones instead of sex hormones.
Yeah, that's about right. We were starting with a good product and we've messed it up in a lot of ways to try and make something better. And that's always the way to change something for the better. You've got to make sure that there aren't the detrimental effects or side effects that come with that.
Yeah, Andy, I think when I started my talk at the Bonsmara annual meetings in South Africa last week, the one thing I said, which I think maybe I'd love to see more of this in the industry, is in any sphere, it's conversation and allowing ideas to compete that has made people better and made society better. And I think we might have got ourselves into a few dogmatic, almost like religious camps on what we believe is right in livestock. And, whether we in the data camp or in the phenotype camp or in the regenerative agriculture camp, or whatever it is, and we're not allowing any ideas to be played with if they aren't in our textbook. And I think I'd love to see us get away from that, where we let all these ideas compete and learn what a platonic conversation is again, because I think that'll be better for the whole industry.
Yeah, well said. And I'm just going to go. Our time's running on here now. PJ, I can listen to you all day, and I'm sure you've got other things to do. And but I did ask what some of my listeners on Toplines and Tales if they've got any questions, and I had one from Juliet Squires, who's quite a well-known Angus breeder, and Juliet was. She was very interested in your thoughts and your own experience and whether there was scientific research to back that up. And I think I think we've kind of covered that one. But she said regarding the confirmation points, it's true that they're more mechanical in nature, but she said your point about bone and fertility is interesting. I can't remember quite what you said about the bone and fertility going side by side, but she's intrigued to know how as fertility can be linked to how much bone you have. Is that? She said it doesn't apply in horses certainly, and is that something that there's science behind?
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question, and there is science behind this. So you've got two sets of hormones at play. You've got your growth hormones. That are the hormones that start, from conception. And they are responsible for the length of the long bones, for the diameter of the long bones. They basically build the frame of the animal and muscle, partly as well. Now, the sex hormones only start when those long bones ossify and the growth hormones stop. And once the sex hormones start, then the animal's growth plateaus, and what happens is the animal starts getting heavier, more dimensional. The muscle takes more shape. So, for example, a bull's got more muscle shape and tone than a steer, for example, especially through his forequarter, through his neck and shoulder, etc. Now, what happens if you're propagating bone diameter or width, maximizing it, you are delaying the sex hormones from kicking in. And when you delay sex hormones, you suppress fertility. Yeah. So that's the scientific way to say that optimized bone would be more, if your objection is more fertile cows, then optimizing bone diameter or bone density would be preferred to maximizing it.
Okay, I think that clears that up there, Juliet. I hope that clears that up for you. I could ask you questions all day. I don't think I will ask any more just now. We've certainly heard a lot of science here, and it's nice to hear a judge, and I know you do this on a regular basis, and something we do more of in the UK than we used to, but a judge to stand up there and judge a whole load of classes, then stands there and gives his reasons behind them, and I know you give your reasons right the way down the line in a lot of cases, and that's great to hear you actually telling us the science behind those reasons that you're giving.
Well, Andy, I think it's essential. You think of how much money and effort, like how much treasure and time and talent goes into bringing an animal to a show. I think the least the judge can do is explain why he's doing what he's doing with that animal.
Yeah.
Actually, after the Houston female show that I did, the American Heifer show, I think there were two of us who shared the breeds, about 1,200 heifers between us. And I had a guy who was a lovely guy. He just was a little confused as to why I didn't like his heifer as much as he does. And I said, well, let's chat about it. And I was on the road 2 days later, and we spent an hour talking about his heifer. And I would take it further. I think that at the major shows, so in the UK at the Highland and Great Yorkshire, at the Welsh, have a press conference afterwards. Like get the exhibitors and the ag media to put the show organizer and the judge up on a platform like you would after a rugby game or a football match, and ask them some tough questions, because there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of investment that goes into it, and I think the judges must be prepared to back their play.
Always rely on you for a little bit of controversial comment there. I think that's absolutely fantastic thing to hear there, and I'd quite happily stand behind my judging in such a situation. But I'm not sure everybody would. But you're dead right that they should have the accountability when people are judging, and it's the fault of the people who elected those people to judge if they don't get it right. So judges that can speak and be articulate, obviously, are more in demand, as you are yourself there. And you mentioned the Highland Show, and I believe we're going to have your presence at the Royal Highland Show this year, PJ, which I'm looking forward to.
Andy, I'll have some colleagues there. I might miss it by a day or two. Yeah, I'm working on getting there. I hope I can, but it looks like I might miss it by a day or two.
Well, I'll hopefully catch up with you. I know you are in the UK round about that time, so we'll hopefully catch up there. And I owe you dinner because you bought the last one, PJ, and a great time we had in a fantastic restaurant there in Fort Worth, which was superb. So appreciate that.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, Danny. I'll do a little research and make sure that I find the most top-end restaurant of wherever we are, so we can see how far you can take your pounds.
I can't. I don't think I can eat a 40-ounce steak or whatever it was you put in front of me last time there, but I'll try and match you one with a bit of good local Highland beef, maybe, or even some Ryland lamb. You never know, a bit of Ryland sheep.
Yeah, I can eat a lamb chop any day.
Good man. PJ, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you again. The second time on this podcast. The last time you were on here, I think, was fascinating. We had more listens than probably anybody else that we've had. And again, I hope the listener out there has found this one very informative as well as interesting.
Andy, absolute pleasure always talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Toplines and Tales, and I hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. As always, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Harborough, for their continued support of the Toplines and Tales podcast. And now, with the weather turning to spring, your suckler cows will be getting turned out very shortly, and Harborough's Super Suckler Buckets are a great way to top up the mineral levels that they need and to kickstart bulling and ready to tighten up your calving period. So speak to the team at Harborough if you'd like to get more of your cows in calf this season. So pop down to your local Harborough store or look them up on the internet or give them a call and have a chat with a friendly Harborough representative there, and they'll be able to help you with that. And while you're there on the internet, don't forget to join our Toplines and Tales Facebook group or Facebook community, where you'll find information to back up this and previous episodes.